Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
I've been working as a physical therapist at a private healthcare facility in New Jersey for the past 3 years. The pay was decent, the work environment seemed okay, and most importantly, they offered good benefits, including a 401k retirement plan with employer matching. Back in 2022, when I first started, I was excited about finally being able to start saving for retirement. My previous job at a smaller clinic didn't offer these benefits, so I jumped at the chance to work here. I set up automatic contributions from my paycheck, around 6% of my salary, and my boss was supposed to match 3%. Everything seemed fine at first. I would see the deductions from my pay stubs, and occasionally I'd check my retirement account to see how my investments were doing. In 2023, I noticed something odd. The deposits were only showing up every 6 months instead of with each paycheck, but I figured maybe that's just how they handled it. Last week, I decided to do a thorough review of my retirement account, and what I found made my blood boil. Since January 2024, there hadn't been a single deposit into my account, even though the money was still being deducted from my paychecks. I was sitting in the break room, stressing about this discovery, when one of my co-workers noticed my distress. She asked if I was okay, noting that I looked worried about something. I told her about my discovery, that there hadn't been any deposits into my 401k account this year despite money still being taken from my paycheck. Her face went pale. She immediately said she needed to check her own account. She pulled out her phone and sure enough, she found the same thing. We started asking around, and by the end of the day, we discovered that 13 people in our facility were affected by this. I told her we needed to confront the boss about this. She agreed, calling it outright theft. I sent an email right away expressing my serious concerns about my 401k contributions. I explained that I'd noticed deductions were being made from my paychecks, but no money had been deposited into my retirement account since January 2024. I also mentioned finding that in 2023, deposits were only made every 6 months. I demanded immediate answers and requested that all further contributions be stopped until this was resolved. His response came the next morning, and he claimed he didn't realize people were contributing and said there seemed to be an issue with the account. He promised to ensure all funds would be deposited by December 31st, 2024, along with any lost interest. This was clearly a lie. Everyone in the office knew he'd been having financial problems. He'd recently divorced his wife, and there were rumors about gambling debts. He'd even started driving a much older car and had been cutting corners on office supplies. I gathered all my affected co-workers for a meeting at a nearby coffee shop after work. I explained my theory that he was using our retirement money to cover his personal expenses and insisted we needed to take action. The senior nurse mentioned that her brother was a lawyer and advised us to contact an ERISA lawyer immediately, explaining that this was a federal offense. The billing specialist then told us that she had already reported this to the Department of Labor, who were very interested in the case. We decided to act quickly. Within days, we had secured an ERISA lawyer who specialized in retirement fund cases. The Department of Labor launched an investigation, and what they found was worse than we imagined. Our boss had been doing this to employees for years, even before I started working there. Some former employees had no idea their money had been stolen. The investigation moved surprisingly fast. The Department of Labor doesn't mess around with retirement fund theft. Within weeks, our boss was facing federal charges. The facility was placed under temporary management, and all our missing contributions were restored through an insurance policy the company had. Our boss ended up pleading guilty to embezzlement and violations of federal pension law. He is now facing significant jail time and has been ordered to pay restitution to all affected employees, including those who had already left the company. I found a better job at a larger healthcare network with proper oversight of their retirement plans. Most of my co-workers also moved on to better opportunities. The facility was eventually bought by a reputable healthcare company that retained most of the staff and implemented proper financial controls. Our former boss is now serving a 5-year sentence in federal prison. The judge was quite harsh because he had specifically targeted healthcare workers during a time when we were already dealing with the aftermath of the pandemic. I now check my retirement account from time to time just to reassure myself that my contributions are being properly deposited. Trust but verify, that's become my new motto. I grew up in a small lakeside community in Montana where my parents decided to move after retiring from their corporate jobs in the city. They wanted a peaceful life away from the hustle and bustle, and honestly, it was perfect for me too. As a work-from-home graphic designer, I could work anywhere with decent internet, and this place had fiber optic recently installed. The lake was the community's crown jewel. Everyone used it for swimming, fishing, and kayaking during summer. It wasn't privately owned, it was state property, and our community had legal access to it. That's what made the whole situation with our neighbor so ridiculous. It all started when Karen moved in about 6 months ago. She bought the house right next to the lake access point and immediately started acting like she owned the entire lake. At first, it was just passive-aggressive comments whenever anyone would use her lake. One morning, she complained about how inconsiderate it was for people to make noise while she was trying to enjoy her morning coffee by what she emphasized was her lake. When I explained that this was public access and the lake belonged to the state, she snapped back about how she'd paid a premium for her lakefront property and shouldn't have to deal with all this ruckus. I tried to be reasonable, showing her the community guidelines and property maps, but she wouldn't listen. Things escalated when summer arrived and the neighborhood kids started using the lake more frequently. One hot Saturday, I was working on my laptop on my porch when I heard screaming coming from the lake. At first, I thought it was just kids playing, but then I noticed something was wrong. The screams weren't playful. They were painful. I rushed down to the lake. Karen was standing on her deck with a professional-grade slingshot, shooting at the kids in the water with what looked like hard candy. She had surprisingly good aim, which made the situation even more dangerous. I yelled at her to stop immediately, but she just screamed back about how these little brats needed to learn, claiming she'd told them 100 times it was her private lake. When I pointed out that she was assaulting children and that this was insane, she just told me to mind my own business, insisting she had the right to protect her property. Just then I heard a loud yelp. One of the kids had been hit right above their eye, and blood was trickling down their face. The other kids helped them out of the water, and I rushed to check on them. That's when I recognized who it was. The sheriff's kid. The sheriff had been a fixture in our community for over 2 decades, and everyone knew and respected him. His kid was holding their face, crying while Karen continued her tirade from her deck, shouting that this is what they get, and maybe now they'd listen. I called 911 while trying to help stop the bleeding. Within minutes, we heard sirens, and 2 police cars pulled up. The sheriff arrived right behind them in his personal vehicle, still in his civilian clothes since it was his day off. The look on Karen's face when she saw the sheriff running toward his injured kid was out of this world. All the color drained from her face, and she quickly tried to hide the slingshot behind her back. When the sheriff asked what happened, I explained that his neighbor had been shooting at the kids with a slingshot because she thought she owned the lake. Karen tried to defend herself by claiming they were trespassing, but the sheriff cut her off, asking if she realized that assaulting his child and others with a weapon was a felony. What happened next was probably the most satisfying thing I've ever witnessed. Karen tried to run inside her house, but one of the deputies was already heading around back. They caught her trying to dispose of the slingshot in her kitchen trash. They found a whole cache of ammunition, hard candies, small rocks, and even metal ball bearings. The deputies arrested her right there on her pristine lawn, still in her sundress and expensive sun hat. She was screaming about her rights and how she'd sue everyone, while the sheriff's kid was being treated by the paramedics who had just arrived. The story spread through our small community like wildfire. It turned out Karen had been terrorizing the local kids for weeks, but many were too scared to tell their parents. Some had bruises from being hit, and one kid even had a small scar on their arm from a nasty shot. The sheriff's kid needed 3 stitches above their eye, but they were going to be okay. Karen, on the other hand, wasn't so lucky. She was charged with multiple counts of assault on a minor, reckless endangerment, and use of a weapon to commit a felony. Her perfect lakefront house went up for sale 3 weeks later. The new neighbors who moved in are a retired couple who love having the local kids swim in the lake. They even set up a floating dock for everyone to use. And now when I'm working on my porch, I can hear the kids playing and splashing around. No more screams of pain, just pure joy. The way it should be. Karen ended up taking a plea deal and got probation plus community service. She had to move in with her sister 2 states over, and she's banned from living near any public waterways. The sheriff made sure that last part was included in her probation terms. My grandmother was an incredible woman who basically helped raise me. My parents both worked long hours when I was growing up, so I spent most of my weekends at her house. She was this elegant, graceful lady who had the most amazing collection of vintage jewelry, and our favorite thing to do was to sit in her bedroom while she told me stories about each piece. She would hold up pieces and tell me their stories. Like when she showed me her pearl necklace, she told me how my grandfather gave it to her on their first wedding anniversary. Or when she'd show me her sapphire earrings, she'd explain that they were a graduation gift from her mother. Every piece had a story, and I knew them all by heart. My cousin, let's call her Karen since she is certainly acting like one, was always more interested in wearing the jewelry to show off at family events. She'd prance around at every gathering, wearing whatever piece caught her eye, making sure everyone noticed her. I never minded because my special moments with Grandma were private, just between us. Last year, my grandmother passed away after a brief illness. During her final weeks, she was completely lucid and even updated her will just a month before she died. When the will was read, she had left me her entire jewelry collection. I was touched but not entirely surprised. We had that special bond after all. That's when everything went sideways. Karen immediately demanded that I give her the jewelry collection. When I asked her why I should do that, she claimed that Grandma had promised it to her years ago. She insisted that as the oldest granddaughter, everyone knew she was the only one who truly appreciated those pieces. I tried to explain that Grandma had never mentioned any such promise and pointed out what was clearly stated in the will. But Karen just got angrier. She shouted that she didn't care what the will said, suggesting that Grandma must have been confused or pressured. She even accused me of manipulating Grandma during my weekend visits. The accusation stung, but I stood my ground. I told her she was being ridiculous, pointing out that Grandma had updated her will just a month before passing while completely clear-headed. Karen just kept insisting I was being selfish, reminding me how she always wore those pieces at family events and how everyone remembered Grandma loving to see her in them. The next thing I knew, my phone was blowing up with messages from family members. My aunt suggested I should give Karen a few pieces just to keep the peace. My uncle reached out saying Karen was really upset and asked if I couldn't share the collection. But then my mom called with a different message. She told me not to give in, explaining that Grandma had specifically told her she was leaving the pieces to me because I cared about the stories behind them, not just how they looked. That's when Karen took it to social media. She started posting these dramatic stories about how I'd stolen her inheritance and how I was tearing the family apart. She even posted old photos of herself wearing Grandma's jewelry at various events with captions like, "Remember when Grandma chose me to wear her precious jewelry?" Funny how some people can be so selfish. I was about to just give her a few pieces to shut her up when my grandfather, Grandma's husband, stepped in. He'd been quiet throughout this whole drama, but apparently he'd had enough. He called a family meeting and brought out Grandma's diary from her last years. With trembling hands, he read an entry from just weeks before she passed. The entry explained how she decided to leave her jewelry to her youngest granddaughter, noting that I was the only one who ever asked about the stories behind each piece. The diary entry mentioned that while others just saw pretty things to wear, I saw the memories, the love, and the history behind them. That's what these pieces were really about. Karen turned white as a sheet, but it got better. Grandfather then brought up the subject of missing pieces from their anniversary dinner last year, the ones Karen had borrowed and never returned. Turns out Karen had borrowed several pieces over the years and never brought them back. She'd even tried to sell one at a local jewelry store, but thankfully the owner knew my grandmother and called her about it. Karen stormed out of the meeting, but not before my grandfather made it clear that if she didn't return every single piece she'd taken, he'd be pursuing legal action. Within a week, a box arrived at his house containing 5 pieces of jewelry I'd never even known were missing. Now the family has gone surprisingly quiet on the share the inheritance front. Karen still posts occasional vague references to toxic family members, but most people just ignore her now. The jewelry collection sits in my bedroom, each piece still carrying its special story, just like Grandma wanted. And every time I look at them, I can still hear her voice telling me about the memories behind each one. After losing my tech job during the recent layoffs in Silicon Valley, I had to downsize significantly. I found this nice little property in a quieter part of California that fit my budget perfectly while I got back on my feet. The landlord seemed like a genuinely nice guy, maybe too nice for his own good, and the rent was reasonable. Everything was fine for the first few months. I landed a new job at a startup and things were looking up. Then I started noticing strange things happening. Sometimes I come home to find my mailbox open, or things would be slightly moved around on my porch. At first I thought I was being paranoid. Then I met her, the landlord's wife. She showed up one day while I was getting home from work. I'll never forget that first encounter. She immediately demanded to know who I was and what I was doing there. I explained that I was the tenant and had been living there for 3 months. She became agitated, insisting that it was her house and that her husband had no right to rent it out. I tried explaining that I had a legal lease, but she wasn't having any of it. She started showing up randomly, taking pictures of the property, and even tried to peek through my windows a few times. I later learned from my landlord that she had been in and out of rehabilitation facilities all year, dealing with some serious mental health issues. He apologized profusely for her behavior, but didn't do much else to stop it. Then came last Saturday. I returned from grocery shopping to find all my locks changed. Standing there with my melting ice cream and a growing sense of panic, I heard her voice behind me. She smugly told me that she was having the property appraised for the divorce settlement and that I needed to leave. When I protested that I lived there and that this was illegal, she screamed that it was her property and threatened to call the police if I didn't leave right away. I ended up sitting in my car for hours, calling my landlord repeatedly until he finally answered. When he arrived, he was apologetic as usual, saying sorry and explaining that she wasn't well, promising to get me back in. When I asked if he could get her key back, he just weakly suggested that we should avoid confrontation and hope she calms down. That's when I realized I needed to take matters into my own hands. I spent Sunday researching tenant laws and speaking with legal professionals. On Monday, I sent her a carefully worded message explaining that her actions were illegal and that I would be pursuing a restraining order. Her response? She started bombarding me with threats. She sent multiple messages saying she was calling the police right that moment and that I was trespassing on her property. She threatened to have all my things thrown out on the street. She kept sending message after message, demanding that I get out repeatedly. But I was prepared this time. I had already installed security cameras and spoken with the local sheriff's department. They confirmed that she had no legal right to evict me and that what she did was illegal. I filed for an emergency restraining order that same day. The breaking point came when she actually tried to enter the property again, but this time I had it all on camera. The restraining order was granted immediately, and my landlord finally grew a spine when he saw the legal trouble her actions could cause him. He had the locks changed and gave me the only set of keys. She tried to fight it, of course, but between the security footage, her threatening messages, and the documented illegal lockout, she didn't have a leg to stand on. The judge not only upheld the restraining order but also ordered her to stay at least 500 feet away from the property. These days, things are quieter. I still check my security cameras regularly, but at least I can come home without wondering if I'll find my belongings on the street. The landlord even reduced my rent as an apology for everything that happened. I'm saving up to move, though. Some peace of mind is worth more than cheap rent. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.